Good morning again. I think that if everybody is seated, come in, David. I would like to start again the proceedings of the second part of our morning session, and the moderator of this second part of the session, Full Steam Ahead in the Age of Uncertainty, is the journalist, well-known journalist, shipping journalist, and Lloyd's List editor, David Osler. And he will introduce the members of this panel, but there is one I would like to introduce myself, because unfortunately Emanuele Grimaldi, due to a family problem, will not be with us this morning. We wish him and his family the best. So David and I thought that Mark van Peel, the president of the Port Authority of Antwerp, could take his seat. Mark is a friend of mine. I was president of the Port Authority of Naples in the late 90s, but I didn't know him at that time. I knew his predecessor, and we became friends quite recently through our mutual, my colleague Guy, that I thank for this. But he's also a politician. He's a political person and the vice mayor of Antwerp. So I think he's the best fitted person to play by the ear in a session that is obviously not only for the moderator and for the presence of Roberto da Limonte, one of the most distinguished Italian and international politologists, and the other distinguished speaker. It has got very much to do not only with shipping and the economics, but with the politics of the world. So David, I hand you over to you, and I think you will introduce the other panelists, and I ask also the panelists to reach us on the stage. Thank you. And a big clap to David.
Naples for the 8th edition of Shipping and the Law Conference. We're meeting at what seems to be a very auspicious time for this city, because SSC Napoli are sitting on top of Serie A after 7 successive wins. So let's hope that's a good omen for our gathering. But maybe Manchester City will bring that run to an end next week. It's my pleasure to introduce an exceptionally strong panel of speakers who I hope will offer a range of views on the prospects for shipping in what is an age of populism and protectionism. I think those of us who believe in free trade are looking at the political situation in many countries with some concern right now. As we are in Naples, let's start with Italy, which remains the Eurozone's 3rd largest economy. The Five-Star Movement is being seen as a potential government coalition partner at next year's general election, and a ballot of its membership last April voted to make opposition to European Union free trade deals the party's main foreign policy priority. I myself live in Britain, which of course decided to leave the European Union in a referendum in 2016. The divorce talks are currently taking place in Brussels, and all the indications are that they are deadlocked. The most likely scenario now is the so-called cliff edge Brexit, which its supporters say will boost UK's trade with the rest of the world. Remainers fear it will generate gridlock on the waterfront at ports that handle trade with continental Europe. Finally, let's look across the Atlantic, where next month we'll see President Trump celebrate the first anniversary of his election victory. His presidency seems to have made a slow start due to significant domestic opposition to his plans, but according to reports, he is frustrated by his inability to deliver the trade restrictions and the tariff barriers that he promised during his campaign. But he still has a projected 3 years to make good on his pledges. And let's be realistic, shipping sometimes benefits from protectionism, with the Jones Act in the US perhaps the clearest example. It's a complicated picture, but we have an excellent panel to help us discuss the issues at hand. I'm going to introduce them one by one. In most cases, I'm going to ask them to restrict themselves to a 2 or 3 minute presentation, and I'll be quite strict on that. And then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions each. After that, we'll convene a panel discussion. The exception is going to be, however, our first speaker, Roberto Dalimonte, the Dean of Politics at the prestigious LUISS Carlo Guido University in Rome. He's a former visiting professor at Yale and Stanford universities, and he's got a slightly longer presentation he's prepared with some slides. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes, Roberto, and then stay at the rostrum and I'll ask you a couple of questions.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Roberto Dalimonte.
Thank you very much. I'll try to speak no longer than 10 minutes. First of all, I have to say that I'm very happy to be here. Once more, I was here 2 years ago. Every time I come, I wish that Francesco Lauro were a political scientist, because his capacity to put together so many interesting people in such great location is what we need in political science, also Francesco. So thank you for inviting me again. My job here, as I understand, is to set the context. The context of today's uncertain world. Uncertain world because it's a world of political and economic disruption. And I will give you some data. That's why I will be speaking longer. Give you some data to try to understand, where the sources of political disruption, the populism, and that David was speaking about. But first of all, let me start with a statement. We are in an age of political disruption because in the Western world today, there are millions and millions of people who are very pissed off. Pissed off is not a technical term, but if you prefer, I can say that there are millions of people who are very, very angry. Angry. That's the way we explain Trump, the Trump phenomenon, anger. The Brexit phenomenon, it's anger. The fact that for the first time in the post-war period, we have an extreme right party sitting in the Bundestag in Germany. The fact that in civilized countries like Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, we see the growth, the continuing growth of populist parties. And the same things goes for France. Le Pen, she was defeated, but look at the data. And the same thing goes on for my country, Italy. In Italy today, the largest party is a party founded by a comedian, Mr. Grillo, the Five-Star Movement. Anger. Why this anger? I think you already know the main reason. The main reasons are two factors that have been mentioned in the previous panel: globalization and the technological revolution. I don't need to go into these factors because you know them. My job is to give you data to explain how these factors have created anger and the political disruption that we are witnessing today in the Western world. And the first piece of data is the following. Probably the most important one. This is the share of the world GDP from 1980 to, there's a projection here. Look what has happened in the last few years in the world. The redistribution of income at the world level. The world has become more equal. The percentage the share of the world GDP of emerging economies has surpassed that of developed economies. This is probably the most significant graph that I have to show you. Because this graph, if I had the time, I don't, really explain what is going on. Because greater global equality, which is what this chart shows us, has created greater country level inequality, as we will see later. This lower graph just gives you a further explanation, the contribution to the world GDP of developing economies, emerging economies, and you can see here that emerging economies today contribute to the world GDP more than developed economies. Let me just give you a simple consequence of this, having to do with left-wing parties in Western world. You know that the left-wing tradition in Europe has been, until now, an internationalist tradition. The communist and socialist parties were international parties. Today, they are losing their voters because of this. But let's continue, because otherwise David will cut me off. I mentioned before country level inequality, because this is one of the major problems that we're witnessing today, one of the major reasons of the political disruption that we are looking at. Look at the share of labor income to national income in OECD countries. Look how much labor has lost vis-a-vis capital. Why so? Because we know the technological revolution is changing the type of jobs, automation, and all the consequences. And we have just started to see the beginning of this, because it will continue. We're just at the beginning of the technological revolution. Think of not just the internet, 3D printing has not made yet the kind of impact that it will make. Artificial intelligence, intelligent machines, they're learning. All of this will continue to change this ratio. And this ratio is also behind the political disruption that we are talking about. But this is even more interesting. This speaks about job and income polarization. The data are about Europe. What has been going on in the past 20, 30 years? Those factors that we mentioned, globalization and particularly the technological revolution, have changed the job market. In the past, technological changes have created eventually middle-class jobs. Today, this is not happening. The technological revolution is creating high-paying jobs, the black column, low-paying jobs, the green column, these are the various European countries, and is destroying middle-class jobs, the pink columns. So not only the working class, the blue-collar working class is being affected, and it's angry. The middle class in Western countries is angry. The people who vote for Trump, people who voted for Brexit, people who voted for the AfD in Germany, who vote for Grillo, they're not just working class, uneducated people. They're educated people, middle class people. Last but not least, this is only a piece of data referring to the United States. The pattern is the following. Greater global equality as a result of emerging economies gaining the share, greater share of the world income. Greater country level inequality as a result of globalization and the technological revolution. Loss of middle income jobs, All of this is creating political polarization, not just political disruption, political polarization. This is an interesting piece of data which I was able to find reflecting how in the United States, but I believe that this, if I could find the data, when I will have more time next year, if Francesco will invite me, I will present the data for the other countries. It shows this data. This is the distribution of income, the Gini index, which shows the distribution of income, which you see in the United States has become more and more unequal. Look at the rise of inequality. The rise of inequality is correlated to the rise of political polarization in the US Congress. And Trump is another example of that, of political polarization. So growing inequality is bringing about growing political polarization, which in turn brings about more and more difficult governments, difficulty to govern countries where the level of disruption is so high. Traditional political coalitions are breaking down across the Western world. And some countries are able to cope better than others. In general, what we've been looking at is the tendencies of traditional parties to defend themselves vis-à-vis the rise of populist parties which are supported by anger, and by anger which comes from this data that I show you. Well, traditional parties tend to defend themselves by getting together, creating centrist coalition. This has happened in Germany. It will happen in Germany. It has already happened in Germany in the last 4 years. It will happen again after what the last elections. This will happen in Italy. David mentioned the next election in Italy in the spring. I can tell you already, because I'm a prophet, that Mr. Berlusconi and Mr. Renzi will have to form a coalition together, a centrist coalition together, because the largest party in Italy is a populist party, the Five Star, which will not be able to form a government. Even in France, in a sense, under different circumstances, we've seen the same. Macron's victory is the result of his ability to bring together moderates of the left and moderates of the right, excluding the extreme right and extreme left. This so far has been the response. But will it last? Will it last? We hope it will last, because this is the way that our democracies are now being governed. But to tell you the truth, I have some fears, because the strength of the phenomena that I have tried very briefly to describe you, it is such that I don't see yet the kind of political response, except for what I just told you about this defense strategy. I do not see the kind of political response that is necessary to reduce the level of frustration, of anger of so many millions of people. And this, in our democratic system, is a real problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stay there, yeah. Stay there.
David, did I stick to the 10 minutes?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for those remarks, Roberto. Roberto, you're a senior political scientist. As you know, most economists since the time of Ricardo 250 years ago have all agreed that free trade is the best way to economic growth, and economic growth is the best way to create jobs. So why is it that do you think that populist parties won't support free trade? Aren't they just betraying their supporters by not doing so?
Because there is and this has been true, it's true today and it's true in the past, with one difference that I pointed out. There is a disconnect between the changes that are being created by free trade and the technological revolution. The two things go hand in hand. Changes in the labor market, jobs are being destroyed faster than the possibility to create new jobs. There is a disconnect that it will be eventually solved. Eventually, there will be jobs. Eventually, our kids, the way more of our kids will become engineer, computer scientists, or develop skills that the new economic context demand. But today, as I show you, so many middle-class jobs are being destroyed. But think of the banking industry, just to mention one. You know, and these jobs are not replaced by other middle-class jobs, as I've shown you. Eventually, this will be done. But in this phase of transition, and we have seen transition before, no? In this phase of transition, we have to come up with solutions that protect our democratic environment, which is also the environment where your shipping industry
Okay,
will
and
function.
Roberto, last year, of course, I watched the government lose the Brexit referendum in my own country, and then with horror, I looked to Italy and saw Mr. Renzi's government lose a referendum on constitutional reform.
Yes.
Do you think that these governments made a mistake in going to the people with referendum like this? Is this something they should have avoided?
Well, in Britain, you should have avoided to hold a referendum to start with, because you know you're challenging me, David. You're challenging me. That's dangerous, because I feel that it was a mistake to call for the referendum. I believe in representative democracy. I believe in the fact that Britain has been the historical champion of representative democracy, and all of a sudden, on an historical decision, where people where millions of people cannot understand the consequences, you go directly to the people. You know, I must say that from this point of view, I admire the Germans. Have you seen a referendum in Germany? Did Helmut Kohl ask the German people their approval when he decided for the euro? If he had done so, do you think we would have the euro today? Of course not. Kohl went to the Bundestag and said, this is a matter of war and peace. We have to do it. We Germans have to take the initiative. He didn't ask for a referendum. He took responsibility, because this is what representative democracy is. So you're challenging me, David.
Okay.
And David Cameron, unfortunately, called for the referendum for partisan reasons. And you know, I don't have to explain this to you. And he lost the gamble, and he put Britain, in my opinion, it's my opinion, on a very difficult situation. In the case of Renzi, the referendum was not a choice. It was mandated by the Constitution, but he managed the path to the referendum very badly. But again, it is interesting why the referendum was lost by Mr. Renzi. It was not lost because of the content of the constitutional changes. We have tons of survey data that show that the people voted against Renzi, not against the Constitution, against the government. Because this is the tendency today, to vote against the government. And the anti-European attitudes of so many people around Europe is not just against Europe, it's against the European government. Today, and it's unfortunately so, it has become very difficult to govern. Government is a liability, is not a benefit. And you see constant rotation in power, which is also not a functional thing, but is all due to this political disruption, the political uncertainty that I've tried to describe here very quickly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Right, great thanks to our next speaker, who's stepping in at the very last minute in place of Emanuele Grimaldi, who is unavoidably unable to be here. Mark Van Peel, ladies and gentlemen, is chairman of the board at the Port of Antwerp, one of Europe's largest ports, of course, and a former member of Parliament for the Flemish Christian Democrats. So welcome to the stage, Mark. Could you give us your remarks?
Ladies and gentlemen, I fully agree with the analysis of the professor. So I will not repeat it. I will only add one important thing in the rise of populist and extreme parties, which is the fear for immigration, the Islam question, the terrorists, and that is also very complicated, but is reduced by extremist parties to simple slogans. So that explained, for instance, in my country, in Belgium, the rise of a very extreme right-wing party, very racist party, in the early 90s. And the response of the traditional political parties was the pledge to the people, we will not govern with that party. And that pledge lasted for 25 years. And they were also very, very anti-globalization and very protectionist. So we succeeded in not letting interfere the extremists in the governance of the country. But what happened, and there I complete from a Belgian point of view what the professor said, what happened? The traditional political parties reacted by becoming more fearful of migration, more fearful of globalization, and there was a new democratic right-wing party which has its origins in wanting to separate the northern part of Belgium, Flanders, from Belgium. That was their origin, but now they are governing Belgium and they don't mention that anymore. But, and there I raised the basic question of the moderator, they are also increasingly becoming more and more against globalization, against Europe. They are very skeptical about Europe. And that's, I think, the danger for our democracies. I don't see much danger in becoming, in all those countries, extremist parties really to become dominant in the governments of the countries. I don't think that. But the traditional parties, in order to maintain their votes, are also not only on the political and the migration level, but also on the economic level. They are tending towards positions very bad for globalization, for rise of protectionism, etc. So that's the main issue, and we have to hope that we will have good leaders, as in my view Merkel or Macron, who are trying to do the change, listening to the people, but not falling in the gap or the trap of very simple solutions to very complicated questions. That's the reason why I also fully agree with referenda are a very, very bad thing in democracy. But that's very difficult to explain to people, because you give the impression, well, we ask the opinion of the people, but you ask the opinion of the people in one simple question, whereas the voters are voting for many reasons, and mostly not because of the question that was asked, anger against the government, etc. So, short, yes, I see a threat. No, I don't fear imminent danger, but when traditional parties in Europe are tending towards listening too much to those voices, then we could become more vulnerable also concerning economic development. And what happened in Great Britain really was an accident due to a referendum. David Cameron had big problems within his own party, and in order to solve the problem within the divide in his own party, he called up for a referendum, and then people, for several reasons against the government or migration, very, very great issue, voted And now the accident has happened. So we must be responsible politicians and economists and business people and make those accidents not happen again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. To be clear, I was expressing my opinion and of course not that of Mr. Emanuele Grimaldi. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for that excellent lead-off, Mark. But let me start by asking you something in your capacity as the head of a major port. Just from a business point of view, how do you view the political shift away from free trade? Is this the stuff of nightmares for you? Is it having an effect already, or can you see it having an effect maybe over the next 5 or 10 years?
Not yet, because I think, considering Trump, I think Trump could be a good thing for democracy. I'm fearing his attitude towards North Korea and nuclear threat, but for democracy, it's good that extremists all over the world can see that when an extremist becomes a politician, it's not necessarily better. But that I hope. But Brexit for the European ports, for the Northwest European ports, Brexit, of course, is a major issue. But there will be losers and winners. There will be losers and winners. We are making studies within the small country of Belgium and within the bigger range of the Le Havre-Hamburg range. And there we are seeing, depending on what kind of cargo is going and what kind of cargo is levied more and has to pay more duties, etc., some ports will benefit, others will suffer. And it's very unpredictable to say who will be in the camp. So we are more worried about Brexit and not so much about American protectionism.
But can you see the North Continent range ports taking traffic from Felixstowe, Hull, maybe Dover?
I think so. I think it could be very, very good possible. For instance, we have a not so big but important port, Zeebrugge, on the coastal side, on the seaside, and a lot of traffic could go via Zeebrugge instead of ports in Great Britain. That's a possibility. That's a possibility. But on the other hand, they are serving a large region where there is frozen food and vegetables exported to Great Britain, and they're fearing a lot of cargo loss because of Brexit, mostly if what everybody fears a little bit, there will be no sensible agreement between Great Britain and the European Union, but we will fall in the abyss. I hope not, but I think it's a very, very possible scenario.
Okay, and you've mentioned, of course, Vlaams Blok and Vlaams Belang, and the Belgian political system has met the challenge of seeing these parties off. What's your advice to politicians in other countries? What can they learn from you?
Well, I think that voters are sensible people, and that although they are tempted by very simplistic slogans, as we all humans do, they are tempted by very simplistic slogans, but in the end, they have the intelligence to know that it's better to give confidence to centrist politicians taking difficult and complex decisions for a very difficult and complex world. I think voters are sensible enough when they are not limited to just give an answer to one vote in one referendum.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for that excellent presentation. And ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Thomas Rehder, also a big name in the shipping industry. He's president of the European Community Shipowners Association. He's also managing partner of his own family firm, Karsten Rehder, so he's very well placed to tell us about developments in Germany. Thomas Rehder, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. While I see my friend Panos Laskaridis in the first row there, let me just correct that I'm past president, Panos is vice president, and Niels Medegaard is our president at the moment. I find myself in a fascinating political debate here at the moment, which is much more political than maritime, less maritime actually than I expected. And I'm grateful to Professor Dalimonte for the slides that he has presented to us, because I think they hit the nail on the head. And I can only fully support what you have said about the situation in Germany. If we had known the instrument of a referendum, and I think it was Maggie Thatcher who said that a referendum is the dictatorship of the majority over the minority, if we had had that, then certain political decisions would have looked quite differently. And maybe also Europe would be in a different shape today. Having said that, we have to deal with decisions like in the UK with Brexit. And as somebody who has an English grandmother, personally I find it a tragedy and very deplorable. And in a business context, I cannot understand that a country like Britain decides and expresses the wish to now finally shape the global Britain, and at the same time turns its back on the biggest single market that we have in the world, which was also created by Maggie Thatcher, and instead Theresa May is traveling to Erdogan's Turkey or is trying to do business with Trump's US, where obviously they are not having the stronger hand in negotiating free trade deals. But perhaps the trade with New Zealand for fresh butter and milk will make up for that. Now let me bring these thoughts a little bit more back to our maritime world, because the political developments that Professor Dalimonte described are having a lot of protectionist decisions and effects as a consequence. And I listened to a professor from Maastricht the other day who was specialized in monitoring protectionist politics. And it is frightening when you see that thousands of acts of protectionism are passed by parliaments worldwide every year. Now, this is especially surprising because in our maritime field, we can see that we had the experiment of an extreme protectionist legislation since the 1920s in the United States, and they call it Jones Act. It was a consequence of decisions that were provoked by the end of the First World War, more for military than for business reasons. And today we find that such an extreme protectionist policy has created, I would call it a maritime museum. It has stifled innovation. It has created a completely outdated, overaged, technically outdated fleet. It comes at great cost for the environment because, of course, it is not efficient, it is not fuel efficient, it is not environmentally friendly in terms of emissions. It also prevents innovation. It doesn't even help the shipbuilding industry, which is also not competitive in the United States. And I think what is probably the most negative effect, it does not create employment, and it comes at great cost to the consumers. And those of you who have recently read The Economist may have read an article about the Jones Act, describing exactly all these effects. And it ends with a statement, and I was amazed to read this, that the farmers in Hawaii are actually flying their cattle to the continental US because it is too expensive to send it by ship. So will this help to create the kind of mid-income jobs that Professor Dalimonte says we need in order to create stability? I think to the contrary, because when you look at the NAFTA trading bloc, 80% of their trade is shore-based. We could have much more. Could have much more shipping activity within the NAFTA bloc, and this would help to create employment on the ships. It would create employment in the ports. It would reinvigorate ports that at this moment are not properly used, that don't have any adequate business. It would come with a great push in innovation, and it would help the environment. And I think there we can see that after a certain time we can reach beyond the difficult period of transition, and that we could in effect achieve positive results from overcoming protectionism. And we have the negative result in effect at the moment. So maybe I finish it right there, because it is such a nutshell example in my mind of what we should not have And at ECSA, just to say that as a last remark, at ECSA we have tried to bring as much input for the European negotiators for TTIP, and they were very grateful, and they say that shipping is one of the aspects where the European Union can actually insert trading points in international free trade agreements to the benefit of Europe. We have to wait until Trump finally is out of office to resume these talks, but I think we should bear that in mind whenever international talks are going on. Shipping should be addressed also.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Right, now stay there, Thomas, because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Starting with a maritime question. You're also a noted operator of container ships in the feeder segment. We were discussing that privately earlier this morning, but perhaps you could give the audience some idea of how the market is for you right now.
You mean I should share our private conversation?
Yeah.
Container shipping has gone through a very difficult period over almost 10 years. You have seen ups and downs in the bulk shipping industry. You have had the offshore business much better over a longer period of time before it finally fell into the present disaster that we are seeing in offshore. Likewise, the tankers have had more ups and downs. Container shipping has been in a difficult position for almost 10 years with only 2 moderate spikes that we have seen. And this, of course, has led to several effects. It has led to the fact that there is an overaging of the fleet and there was a very increased scrapping activity. These will contribute to a gradual recovery, I think, of the markets. It has also meant that we are having a fleet which is technologically not up to today's standards. But what are today's standards? I don't want to address that because there's a lot of uncertainty also. And I think as far as container shipping is concerned, you can see that the present situation is, like always, not a result of just one factor, it's a result of several factors. We had the financial crisis, followed by the euro crisis, and then we had also this enormous competition between the major container lines to try and new build themselves out of the crisis. And they had built the market to death, and only by that time they realized that the only way of overcoming that was consolidation. And this cascading effect has, of course, had a tremendously negative impact on the market in general, not only on the freight rates, but also on the charter rates, and we're only very gradually coming out of that.
Okay, and a question about the European Union. I mean, one of the jokes that was doing the rounds among Brexit supporters in Britain is that the European Union is a French jockey on a German horse. They said it works very well for Germany, it enables them to keep down currency rates and maintain their position as the world's leading exporter. That's what the opponents say. Do you think there's anything in that criticism?
I think, just take the number that German industry is employing about 300,000 people in the UK today with investments of direct investments of several billion. And they are not producing a complete product. They're producing parts of their value chain that is produced in different parts of Europe. And it only works because we have this intermodal, interconnecting way of producing products in Europe today. And that only works if we have common standards and we have no tariffs and we have no duty and we have a seamless stream between the European countries. Once you interrupt that, it comes at great cost to the economy, especially of the UK. It is a self-inflicted wound that they are creating there. And it is a misconception to believe that German industry will go to the government and insist that they are taking a soft stand on Brexit. I think to the contrary, that will not happen. And when you look at the famous complaint about bureaucracy, what bureaucracy are we talking about? When you are a company that is producing a technical appliance in the Midlands, and you are a small family-owned company, what is better for you? You have the UK market or you have a market of 400 million? And if you want to service a market of 400 million, you'd like to have one common standard, because otherwise you cannot service that. Siemens can service a market with 15 or 28 different standards, but the small family company in the Midlands cannot, but they want to have the same 400 million consumer market. And therefore it is in the interest, especially of family-owned and smaller businesses to establish common standards, because only that enables them to use the large market. So that is the backside of the famous complaint about bureaucracy in Brussels. And let me just say, I understand the bureaucracy in Brussels is probably smaller than the number of employees of the city government of Liverpool or Berlin, for that matter.
Thank you very much. And finally, among our speakers, let's look at things from the insurance perspective. And to help us do that, we have John Wiik, who, well known in the hull business, who until the start of this year was Chief Executive of the Norwegian Hull Club. John, can you give us your thoughts?
Thank you. Talking about democracy. If we look at the, call it, three most prominent cultural personalities that we have had in our country, it's Mr. Edvard Grieg, it's Henrik Ibsen. Both of these two people here spent an awful lot of time here in this part of the world. Ibsen himself left Norway in a very bad state, had problems with alcohol, and etc., settled down on the Amalfi coast, went to Ischia, Capri, and Naples. And here he wrote the best books of his life. This very gentleman had a fantastic saying about democracy. And it's rude. It goes as follows. I'm trying to translate directly from Norwegian. It's the following. He didn't believe in democracy for the very simple reason there are more stupid people than clever people. And there might be something in it. No. Turning to a different and much more, in my opinion, alarming observation, which the professor, I think, didn't touch. Yes, we have an angry middle class, more or less in the Western world. But if I'm correct, listening to a biological professor at the university in Bergen, Mr. Harald Kryvi, he says that, and I think I'm pretty accurate, that within the next 50 years, the world population will grow by 4 billion people. If that is correct, about 1 billion will come from the Far East. And you know where the remaining 3 billion will come from? Africa. What we see today, and it worries us like hell, is going to be peanuts if this scenario is taking place. So how do you solve an issue like that? I think we can conclude the world has moved very clearly in the direction of a multi-political arena. We had one hegemon following the Cold War, that was the US. They set the agenda, that's how it is. We have gone from a mono to a pluralistic geopolitical global picture. And I think nobody has phrased it as nicely as a professor at the university in Singapore, NUS, National University of Singapore, Kishore Muhababani. He was the Singapore ambassador to the UN. And his way of describing the world, and I met him only once, he said, following the First World War, the Second World War, the powers of Europe and the world tried to make traffic laws and systems to avoid collisions, thinking of a ship. Today we have a ship, 150 countries, 170, whatever, cabins on board the ship. There's no captain. And then we get to the core of one of the issues that I'm concerned about, of course, and many others how on earth are we going to solve tremendously important issues like health, economy, migration, etc., if there is no captain on board? Because that's where we are. If you live in a multi-geopolitical world, and then my third point, and Britain is leaving, the pluralistic global picture will be that China will be thinking very much about themselves, the US will, the Europe will, but then in the midst of thinking about Europe, we are losing England. Is that a very positive, call it move? We need more than ever to stand by what we are, our cultural heritage, our economic, democratic values. And then we are losing one of the strongest members. And then my final little comment is the following. If you look at what happens in the US now, tax reduction is the sort of key word, or reforming the tax laws. Ultimately, I think it's going to be one thing. It's reducing the tax burden on those who already have a lot. If you do that, how are you going to finance that? What have they done in the last 5 years? You start printing money. And that's, I think, what will happen. If you start printing money, the debt of the US will increase even further. And one of the effects likely to be is that they will be even less able to pay their debt because of the amount it constitutes. What will then happen to the level of interest? Very likely it's going to remain low. So I think I'll stop there by saying these are my few observations, and if there are any questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, John. John, can I start by asking you something about the marine hull market? I expect you might have been in Tokyo 3 weeks ago for the International Union. No, you weren't. I went there myself and heard the statistical presentation which announced that for the 19th year out of the last 20, the hull market had lost money overall. Now, no normal line of business can sustain itself making losses 19 years out of 20. That's just crazy. So what's going on in that market, and how do marine insurers intend to change that?
If I had the answer, of course, I would have been a multimillionaire already. But what I did was basically to say the barrier to entry in a market like marine hull is low, capital flows quickly in, quickly out, and it's very difficult to create a unique position. So when I started, there was about 80% of the premium base was hull. When I left, there was 20. So what you do, you migrate into the product categories with less competition, higher thresholds of competence and capital, and then you make your money there. Right. But then, of course, you have to deliver outstanding service in your core, being hull. But even then, you won't make money.
Of course, you're an insurer. Insurance is all about risk. So when you look at the political situation, do you see any new types of risk emerging? And do you think the insurance industry can offer any kind of products that might protect shipping and other businesses against these new risks?
I think the biggest current risk, fundamentally, single risks, however big they are, the market will be able to cope with it. The biggest risk isn't single risk. It's not the vertical exposure. It's the horizontal. Take Texas, take Miami. When you wipe out huge fleets of craft, yachts, and things like that. I think insurance is the only industry that I know currently that's not making money. And that's because of the US. The big floods, the hurricanes, the global warming effect will pose a huge threat to the insurance industry. And it's not the single event thing, it's the broad exposure that comes from the climate side of it.
Right. But nothing the industry can't cope with. You're there to take our risks for us, aren't you?
I mean, one thing we heard, and this is many years ago, is that if you have a new California earthquake of some size, there is probably not enough money in the world to cover for it.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, John.
David, could
I'll give you the floor, yeah. Do you want the floor?
I don't know.
Okay, Roberto's asked to have the floor.
I just want to reinforce a point that you made. In the next 30 years, Nigeria will have a population as large as that of the United States, around 400 million people, just Nigeria.
Very few politicians dare to speak about this challenge.
Right.
It's huge from any point of view.
If I may say something, David, I think we think in Italy the immigrants that are at the center of the political debate are Muslim, and those who start talking about terrorism, ISIS. In fact, in Italy, the majority, large majority, are Nigerian and perhaps Christian. So with this data that John and Roberto were giving us, were reminding us of this growth of 3 billion people in Africa. And you imagine what would be the situation in the years to come, and how much political tension and exploitation of this tension, instrumental, could be made by perhaps politicians who don't want to solve the problem but want to have the problem. Or I think that what some of these politicians say, we should help them at their home. Yeah. I don't believe, perhaps there might be some exception, but the majority of them is genuine. They are in some way taking the benefit of having this problem and having consensus founded on this problem. But what they say, perhaps without believing it, is real. We don't have to help anybody. I think this is part of the problem that the world, that a global world, should be in charge of. We should manage this. We should address this problem. And I think the shipping community has been, since centuries, has been very international, because we were the means, from the time of Polo and the Chinese and the Viking. You are representative, perhaps. You look like. But I think we probably could send some message also to the people, which I think, this thing should be addressed. And in my opinion, what George Soros says always about it, he made a lot of money on financial speculations using the discrepancy of the system for himself and his investors. And he so is the person who knows better than many of us how important is to have a uniform framework and some international bodies that could address certain problems. We have got, unfortunately, Timio Mitropoulos is not with us this year, or his successor, but we have a very important organization. We had representative of the ICS, of the Shipowners, some of them. I think we should also be a sort of lead, have a sort of lead in really adopting. We should give powers. Sovereignty is a very important thing. When we say I'm a sovereignist, you should be. But I think giving sovereignty part of the sovereignty, now we want to take sovereignty for smaller communities than countries, than states. But a word, I think, in which the brick of sovereignty is as the state, it doesn't work anymore because the local community, the region want to have some of it, and up to a certain extent this may be good. But we should make sure that, and the democratic process, which doesn't mean one vote on every problem, but to put people in the right place who do this. But sorry, I'm taking the role, or I'm only the organizer of the panelists, and stealing use time and space.
If I can make one comment, because the very professor I referred to, he had, I mean, we have to be cautious of having simple answers to enormous problems. But he said, I believe he said, that maybe the best way is to give women education and money. Once you do that, the birth rate will fall. I mean, we can look at what happens in Italy, in Norway. Once they have their education, once they have their own little, don't call it fortune, but able to sustain living, the birth rate falls. And this was his very simple answer.
I'd like to use the time we've got left to turn to the subject of the Trump presidency and what that might mean for shipping. Because on the one hand, yes, the guy is a protectionist for sure, but on the other hand, his policies on the oil industry will help tanker owners, his policies on infrastructure might help heavy lift and bulk, and he's going to cut corporate taxation. That's good for everyone, or so they say. So, Donald Trump, gentlemen, is he a good guy or a bad guy from the ship owner's point of view? Roberto, what do you say?
I'm not a ship owner. I think I can plead the Fifth Amendment.
Okay, fair enough. That was,
no, I can tell you I'm not very sympathetic to Mr. Trump, but I cannot really express from a ship owner perspective. We have ship owners or maritime experts here that should answer your question, David.
Of course, Mr. Tillerson, Donald Trump's Secretary of State, has expressed a very strong opinion. Of course, yeah. But maybe that's best not related to from this platform.
That's right.
What do you think, Thomas, from a ship owner's perspective?
In political terms, I'm extremely critical, but what does it mean for the ship owner? Well, hopefully he leaves us alone as much as possible. Where we see positive effects is perhaps some of the additional demand that's created by his policies in certain areas. And we heard it before when it was mentioned that a lot of what we are seeing in terms of US growth rate has to do with fossil fuels and traditional energy, shale gas, etc. So, and so far it may help. It will be not beneficial in terms of reinforcing protectionist tendencies and reducing trade, restricting free trade. So I think it is a very double-edged sword.
Right, so pros and cons.
It has pros and cons, and the jury is still out.
Right. And Mark, what do you think from your point of view?
Well, I'm not a ship owner neither.
Either.
But from a port point of view, I don't see for the forthcoming future a lot of effects. I don't see it. I don't think that but when the Trump ideology lasts on for another term, with or without him, when protectionism is growing in the United States, then of course there could be major effects. But for the moment I don't see them, also due to the check and balances system within the United States. What I hope, but that's political, is that what happened in several countries and what the professor described very well, what Trump did was wiping away the traditional, not only polarization, but also within his Republican Party. He created, in a way, his own political party. And so Republicans and Democrats, where there are very moderate people in those parties, they will, and I hope they do, reflect a lot upon what would have to change also in their political system. Because the professor was right that inequality is fueling polarization. but the sheer political system of America, where you have to be or a Republican or a Democrat, and where within those parties, mostly Republican, the extremists are gaining a lot of power, the political system in itself, as Macron did in France, they have to reflect heavily on their political system. Otherwise, I think things could go worse, also from a ship owner's and a port point of view.
David, I would like to add something to this. Another feature of the American political system that fuels polarization is the primaries. These primaries is like the referendum. I mean, and it's a paradox because we think of referendums and as primaries as tools of democracy, and they actually foster more polarization. And some people are thinking about this in the US, but nothing is really doing anything about it. And until they have this primary system, we're going to see other examples of candidates that come out from the extremes instead of from the mainstream.
Okay, John, we haven't heard from you yet. Are you a Trump fan or not?
I really don't have a strong opinion about it. I think, in summary, any political scientist would probably say that an increasing protectionism will lead to a decline in global trade and an increase in call it, regional tensions. I mean, these two things go together. You look at Syria. I think that if the US pushes further forward with protectionism, it might, I'm not saying it will, it might have an effect on shipping ultimately.
Yes, sir.
But
Thomas.
I'm not sure.
No, just one last remark. When you want to have a very concrete political effect, which is presently being discussed, then it is the US attitude towards Iran. Because Iran, by far, has not lived up to the expectations that we all had when this agreement was signed. And it is because the US are still blocking payments, are blocking the biggest chunk of financing, etc. If they step out of this agreement, then certainly all of this area will remain on the sidelines of trade, which I don't believe, unfortunately, if they would maintain it and finally unblock some of the financial problems that they are creating, I think it would give a very positive impetus to international trade and also to shipping.
Right. We're coming to the end of our allotted time, but I'm going to give the last word to Roberto. Roberto, there's a lot of countries we could have discussed, isn't there? There's Putin's Russia, Erdogan's Turkey, Maduro's Venezuela, Orban's Hungary. What, in your view, as a political scientist, what hope is there left for liberalism?
On this point, I'm an optimist. It doesn't work. Can you hear me?
Can you stand at the podium? If you
No,
can't
no,
meet-
no.
Should
No, we can hear you.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
No, I am, on these regards, I'm an optimist. I think, as I said before, we're living through a transition. There are reasons for concerns in how we're going to manage this transition, but we've seen transitions before in the history of the world. And I trust, but it's the reason for my optimism, that in times of crisis, we are going to see sooner or later the kind of leadership that we need. It's a matter of trust. I don't see it yet, but in the past, this is what has happened. Crises create opportunities for the shipping industry, but also for political leadership. So I do believe, but we have to be careful as citizens. We have to keep our eyes open. We have to participate in the political process. We have to be aware of what the problems are. And at the end, it's a democracy. And democracies are led by people like us. And so we have to make sure that our voice is heard and that our voice is well informed to be able to make an impact on the real issues that we're facing.
Well, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen, but I thought that was a fascinating panel discussion. So can we have a big round of applause for our panelists, please? Up to you.
I think before we quickly go for lunch, there is, thanks to Giuseppe Bottiglieri, we have got this voting system, and his beautiful and very bright daughters, sorry, and sisters are not here. We have this voting system. I think you or Neville, I think, made some tests. Perhaps we want to test the...
Do we have the questions? Or?
Do we have the questions, Manfredi? If we don't have the question, it's not a problem. We will have the question at lunch.
There we are.
Right. So, can we vote? Can I vote,
We can vote.
David?
Okay, ladies and gentlemen,
No, since we just said that it's not good if everybody votes, can I vote?
you
authorize?
vote.
Yeah, okay. Yes. Can Mark vote? Yeah, okay. You can also vote. Well, you don't want to vote, Professor. Professor can't vote.
Okay.
Can we get the result, Mr. Osler? Mr. Paterniti, perhaps, is up to you. Mr. Lauro, no, I don't. Okay.
But what does the color mean?
Oh, well, the result is one vote in favour of out-and-out free trade, 2 sensible protectionists, and 2 people with no opinion. Can we have the next question, please?
Are we the only ones who are voting?
No, I think so,
The
yeah.
only ones.
Can we have the next question, please?
So, the floor is not
Yeah,
voted.
here we are. Are you worried by the increased pressures for protectionist policies in many countries? Can we vote?
Takes a moment.
Yeah, I think that might be easier.
Maybe it might be easier to go hand.
Oh, and here we are. We have, yes, only one of the panel, only one is worried about the increased pressure. 2 are not, and again 2 abstainers. And the third and final question, please.
But, David, I think this was meant for everybody. If,
Yes.
After the words of Roberto Dallimonte, we cannot vote. I think it's better we have lunch. It's obviously our fault, not Giuseppe, who we thank him. I don't know if you want to tell us something, Giuseppe, from the floor about your views. No. Perhaps we do it after lunch. Okay. So I thank you, David. I thank all of you. And do you want to have a final word? Or, so let's have some good food. And obviously, we have to cut the lunch and be here as soon as possible to regain the proceeding. Otherwise, we will have not dinner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Thanks to all of you.
Thank you. Good to meet you.